sold to a savage alpha king. She thought he was ruthless until that one gift changed her fate. Chapter 1. The Auction. The morning they sold her, Sera wore her mother's dress. It was the only thing left of value in the house. Pale ivory linen gone soft with age. The embroidery at the collar faded from gold to the color of old cream. Her mother had worn it to her bonding ceremony 20 years ago, back when the Fisher family still had a name worth bonding into. Back before the drought. Before the debt. Before Sera's father drank himself into an early grave and left his only Omega daughter as collateral on a loan she had never agreed to and could never repay. She had put the dress on herself, alone in the cold of her room, because Aldrich, her father's cousin, the man who now held the debt and therefore held her, had told her to look presentable. "They're sending a buyer," he'd said, like she was a piece of furniture he was embarrassed to have cluttered up his house for so long. "Clean yourself up." So she had cleaned herself up. She had washed her hair in the basin and combed it until it lay flat and dark down her back. She had rewound the linen suppressant bands around both wrists and the inside of her elbows, pulling them tight, overlapping the cloth until the faint amber scent that marked her as Omega was buried beneath the smell of plain cloth and cold water. She had stood in front of the cracked mirror above the washstand and looked at herself for a long moment. The dress fit, barely. She had grown since her mother wore it, broader in the shoulders, fuller through the chest, and the fabric pulled slightly across the back when she breathed too deep. There was a small mend at the left sleeve she'd done herself with mismatched thread. Her feet were bare, because her only pair of good shoes had a broken buckle she hadn't been able to afford to fix. She looked, she thought, like exactly what she was. An Omega girl from a broken house, wearing borrowed finery, about to be sold to pay a debt she owed for the crime of surviving. She went downstairs before Aldrich came to fetch her. She would not give him the satisfaction of knocking. The buyer arrived at mid-morning. Sera had expected a merchant. Someone fat and transactional, the kind of man who catalogued acquisitions by weight and utility. What came through Aldrich's front door instead were two men in dark traveling coats, both of them tall, both of them carrying themselves with the particular stillness of people who were used to being the most dangerous thing in any room they entered. The coats bore no merchant's mark. What they bore, stitched into the left breast in silver thread, was a sigil she recognized with a cold drop in her stomach. A fractured crown above a crossed sword and chain. The seal of Varek. She knew that seal. Everyone in the southern provinces knew that seal. Varek was the northern kingdom. 3 weeks' ride at hard pace, past the border mountains, past the Ashvin marshes, into territory that the southern mapmakers drew, with a kind of deliberate vagueness that communicated here be things we do not wish to describe in detail. Its king was Rhoran the Unyielding. She had heard that name her whole life attached to stories that escalated depending on who was telling them. A military commander who had crushed 3 uprisings before the age of 30. A ruler whose punishments for betrayal were inventive enough to have become cautionary legend. An alpha so thoroughly dominant that it was said the wolves of his province would not enter his palace grounds because their instincts would not let them be in his proximity without submitting. She had always assumed those stories were exaggerated. Standing in her dead mother's dress with Aldrich beside her counting the coin purse one of the dark-coated men had just handed him, she found herself hoping that was still true. The taller of the two men looked at her with the flat, professional assessment that stripped her down to her components. Height, health, teeth, bone structure. Not unkind exactly. Just thorough. The kind of look a farmer gave livestock before signing the bill of sale. "She's thin," he said to Aldrich rather than to her. "She eats fine," Aldrich said, already defensive, already lying. "She's just built lean. What's she been fed on?" "Whatever the house has." The man looked at her again. She met his eyes because looking away felt like losing something she would not get back. He had pale gray eyes, close-cropped dark hair, and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He did not seem bothered by her eye contact. He reached into his coat and produced a small document case. "Her designation papers," he said to Aldrich again. Aldrich nodded eagerly and produced them from the inside of his vest. Already prepared. Because of course he had been prepared. Because he had been planning this long enough to have the papers ready and pressed. Sera watched the transaction happen around her like weather happening around a post. Fixed, unavoidable, unable to move. The man reviewed the papers, nodded once, and tucked them into his case. "Belongings?" he asked. Aldrich looked at Sera. Sera said nothing. "She travels light," Aldrich said. The man with the scar looked at her bare feet, at the worn dress, at the suppressant bands wound tight around her arms. Something moved briefly across his expression. Not pity. Something drier than pity. And then it was gone. "We leave within the hour," he said. "Get her something for her feet." Aldrich found her a pair of his late wife's shoes. They were too large and rubbed at the heel, but Sera wore them without comment, and followed the men from Varek out of the only house she had ever known without looking back at it. She had told herself she would not look back. She did not look back. The carriage waiting on the road outside was heavy and well-made. Dark lacquered wood, iron-reinforced wheels, the kind of vehicle built for long northern roads rather than comfort. There was a second man already mounted on horseback beside it, and 2 more at the rear, a full escort for a transaction this size, which told her something about how Varek valued its acquisitions. They did not send 4 armed men across 3 weeks of road for something they considered expendable. She did not know if that was reassuring or not. The man with the scar, she had begun thinking of him as Scar since no one had offered names, held the carriage door open for her with a gesture that was technically courteous and functionally non-negotiable. She climbed in. The interior was plain but clean. 2 bench seats facing each other, a small oil lamp on a bracket, a folded wool blanket on the left bench. The blanket was dark gray and heavy and smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something deep and mineral and cold, like snow melt off stone. She could not name it exactly. It was not unpleasant. It made the back of her neck prickle, in a way she did not examine. She sat on the right bench, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Scar took the seat across from her. The carriage started moving. They were 3 hours down the road before he spoke. "You know where you're going," he said. It was not a question. "Varek," she said. "You know whose household." She looked at him. "I recognized the seal." He nodded, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "His name is Rhoran," she said. "I know his name." A pause. "And?" he asked. "And nothing," she said. "Knowing a name doesn't change the road." Something almost like approval moved through his expression before he shut it down. He did not speak to her again that day. The journey north took 18 days. In those 18 days, Sera learned several things about the household of Rhoran of Varek through simple observation, because no one told her anything directly, but people always told you things if you watched carefully enough and kept your mouth useful only for eating. She learned that the men escorting her were not cruel, but were not soft. They did not touch her. They did not speak to her much. But they fed her 3 times a day at every stop, solid road food, hard cheese, dried meat, dense travel bread that sat in the stomach like ballast. After the first day she realized they were watching to make sure she actually ate, and she understood with a cold clarity that she had been delivered to them underfed and they were correcting it. Not out of tenderness. Out of professional standards. She learned that the cedar and cold scent on the blanket was not cedar at all. It was something she could not identify, something that got into her lungs on the first night and made sleeping easier than it had any right to be, given everything. She tried not to think about that. She learned, when they crossed the border into Varek on the 9th day, that the land changed in a way that felt almost deliberate. Softer province light gave way to something starker and more honest. Dark pine forests that crowded the road on both sides, gray-shouldered mountains in the distance, rivers that ran fast and clear over stone beds. It was not beautiful the way painted landscapes were beautiful. It was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. Pure function, nothing wasted. She spent a great deal of the journey with her face at the carriage window, watching it. On the 17th night, camped in a way station 2 hours south of the capital, Scar sat down across from her at the fire and said, without preamble, "He's not what you've heard." She looked up from her bread. "I haven't said anything about what I've heard. You've been thinking it loudly for 18 days, he said. She said nothing. "I'm not telling you it'll be comfortable," he said. "I'm telling you the version of him the southern provinces have constructed is a story they tell to explain things they don't understand about how he runs a kingdom." He paused. "That's all I'm telling you." She looked at him for a long moment. "What's your name?" she asked. A beat. "Davin," he said. "Davin," she said. "Thank you." He got up and went to check the horses. The capital of Varek was called Ashkord, and it announced itself from a distance. Sera had her face at the window again when it came into view. First the outer walls, dark stone the color of charcoal, then the towers rising above them, and then, as the road curved and the trees fell back, the palace itself. She had expected something brutal, a fortress designed only for defense and intimidation, all angles and iron, and the architectural equivalent of a clenched fist. What she saw was something more complicated. Yes, the stone was dark. Yes, the walls were high. Yes, there was nothing decorative about the fortifications. But the palace sat within its walls like something that had grown there rather than been built. The towers uneven in height. The great hall's roofline arched in a way that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back as something almost like warmth. There were trees inside the walls. She could see the tops of them above the stone, dark green against the gray sky. She had not expected trees. The carriage passed through the outer gates, then the inner gates, then into a wide stone courtyard, where grooms and household staff moved with the particular efficiency of a well-run operation. No one scrambled. No one shouted. Things simply happened in the correct order, which told her more about the king who ran this place than any story she had been told. Divan opened the carriage door himself. She climbed down into the cold air of the courtyard and stood very still, while her legs relearned solid ground. The shoes Aldrich had given her had rubbed her left heel raw by the third day, and she'd been favoring the right side of her gait ever since. She straightened it now, by will. A woman came forward from the household staff, middle-aged, dark-haired, with the brisk competence of someone who had spent decades organizing things that other people left disordered. She looked at Sera with an assessing but not unkind eye. "I'm Merit," she said. "Head of household. Come with me." Merit took her not to the king but to a room. This, Sera had not anticipated. She had anticipated being brought immediately before Rhoran, assessed, designated, assigned, processed. Instead, Merit walked her through corridors that smelled of stone and wood smoke and something resinous she couldn't name, up a staircase, down a hall, and through a door into a room that stopped her just inside the threshold. It was not large, but it was a real room. A bed with an actual frame, a proper mattress, blankets folded at the foot in dark gray wool, the same cedar and cold scent she registered, and felt her stomach do something complicated. A washstand with a basin and a real mirror, not cracked. A chest at the foot of the bed. A window with shutters that opened onto the inner courtyard, and through it, she could see the tops of those trees she'd spotted from outside. On the chest sat a folded set of clothes. She crossed to them before she could stop herself. They were simple but well made. A long underlinen in natural white, soft enough that it had been washed many times, a dress in deep charcoal wool that would fall to her ankles, a heavier overdress in the same dark palette with simple lacing at the bodice, warm stockings, and— she picked these up last and stared at them for a moment, a pair of boots. Actual boots, soft-soled, lined with something that felt like fleece, clearly sized for someone close to her height. "How did you know my size?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "Divan sent your measurements ahead 3 days ago," Merit said from the doorway. "He has a good eye." She paused, something like assessment still running behind her gaze. "Your feet are hurt." It was not a question. "The shoes didn't fit," Sera said. "I'll send something for the heel," Merit said. She moved into the room and opened the chest at the foot of the bed, revealing its contents. More linen, a wool sleep shift, what looked like a small kit of basic necessities, a comb, a cake of plain soap that smelled of nothing offensive, a small vial of oil for the skin, linen for her suppressant bands. She'd expected to have to ask about the suppressant linen. She'd expected to have to fight for it. Its presence, already anticipated, already supplied, unsettled her in a way she could not fully articulate. "You'll wash and change," Merit said. "When you're ready, you'll be brought to him." "How long do I have?" Sera asked. "As long as you need," Merit said simply with no subtext, which was somehow its own kind of disorienting. "Water's warm. There's a bolt on the door." She left. Sera heard her footsteps move down the corridor and fade. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, holding the boots. Then she put them down, went to the door, and slid the bolt home with her own hand. Just to confirm it worked. Just to feel the solid resistance of it, the click of the lock catching in its plate, the door that was currently between her and everything outside this room because she had decided it should be. She stood with her hand on the bolt for a moment longer than necessary. Then she went to wash. She came to him an hour later wearing the charcoal dress, her hair combed and damp and pinned back, the boots soft and warm around feet that no longer ached, fresh suppressant bands wound tight at her wrists, her back straight, her hands still, her face arranged into the expression she had perfected over 20 years of life in a body and a designation that the world had taught her to apologize for: calm, contained, unreadable. Divan met her at the corridor junction and walked her to a room at the end of the east wing. Not the throne room, she noted, not the great hall, not any of the formal receiving spaces she had been braced for. A working room, bookshelves, maps, a desk with actual papers on it, a fire in the hearth that had been burning long enough to mean he was here often rather than ceremonially, 2 chairs at an angle to the fire, neither of them positioned for dominance. He was standing at the window when she entered. She had not prepared herself adequately, very large, not in the way that some men were broad simply from good eating, in the way that a mountain was large, something structural about it, the sense that he had been built for a specific function, and the function was weight-bearing. Wide through the shoulders, long in the limb, the kind of proportions that a lesser man would have used to loom. He was not looming. He was standing at his window looking out at his courtyard with his hands clasped behind his back and his weight evenly distributed, and something about the stillness of him was more arresting than noise would have been. He turned when she entered, his face. She had not prepared herself for his face either. She had expected something cruder, a face that advertised its violence, that wore its reputation on its features. What she got was something harder to process. Strong-boned, angular, a jaw that could have been cut from the same dark stone as his palace walls, a mouth that was currently neither smiling nor set, Dark eyes, very steady, the kind of dark that wasn't absence of color so much as density of it. A scar at his throat, old and thin, the kind that came from something that had nearly worked. He was perhaps 10 years older than her, perhaps 12. It was difficult to tell with men built like this, the kind of men who seemed to have arrived at adulthood early and then simply stayed there. He looked at her the way Davin had told her he would not look at her. Not the way the buyer at an auction looked at a purchase. The way a general read a map. Patient. Precise. Giving away nothing about his conclusions. She met his eyes. She had met Davin's eyes on the first day, and it had worked out tolerably. She did not look away. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A degree, barely perceptible. He said, Sera. Not girl. Not Omega. Not the acquisition from the southern provinces. Her name. Her name in his mouth in this room, spoken with the flat certainty of a man who had been told it and intended to use it. And the court around him. The two advisors standing at the edge of the room she had barely registered. When very registered. When very quiet in a way she didn't yet have the context to decode. My lord, she said, because silence felt worse than speaking. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he gestured, briefly, toward the chairs at the fire. Sit, he said. You've been in a carriage for 18 days. He sat across from her, and in the firelight she could see what his face did when it was not being read from a distance. Still controlled, still giving almost nothing away but not cold. Not the cold she had been braced for. Something more like a man who had learned to keep his interior life somewhere no one could get to it, and had been doing it long enough that he'd almost forgotten what it cost. You know why you're here, he said. I was sold to cover a debt, she said. I'm here as property of this household. Something moved across his face, not quite a flinch. Something adjacent to one. That, he said after a pause, is one version of the arrangement. He looked at her steadily. We'll discuss the other version when you've had time to rest. She wanted to ask what the other version was. She did not ask. She was not ready to need an answer from him yet. He stood. The audience apparently was finished, and she stood too automatically, a reflex trained into her by years of rooms where sitting while others stood had consequences. He looked at her feet. The boots fit? He asked. She looked down at them, then back up at him. Yes, she said. Good, he said, simply, like it mattered. Like it was something he had been waiting to confirm. He nodded once, and Davin materialized at the doorway to walk her back. She was halfway down the corridor before she realized her hands were shaking, not from fear or not only from fear, but from something more confusing than fear. The specific, disorienting shake of a person who has tensed every muscle against an impact that has not, so far, arrived. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and kept walking. The boots were warm, and the room had a bolt on the door, and the King of Varek had spoken her name like it was something worth remembering. She did not know what to do with any of that yet. She went back to her room, slid the bolt home, sat on the edge of the bed in the charcoal dress and the soft boots, and stayed very still for a long time, listening to a palace that was nothing like what she had been told to expect, trying to locate the trick in it. She did not find one. That, more than anything, was what kept her awake until the fire burned low and the courtyard outside her window went quiet, and the cold northern dark settled over Ashkord like something patient, like something that had learned long ago there was no use in rushing. Chapter 2. The King. Sera did not sleep well her first night in Ashkord. This was not surprising. What was surprising was the reason. She had expected to lie awake cataloging threats, mapping exits, running through the architecture of her situation the way she had learned to do in any new and dangerous place. Methodically, without sentiment, until she had a working model of what she was dealing with and where the pressure points were. Instead, she lay awake thinking about his voice, not what he had said. The way he had said it. Sera. 2 syllables, flat and certain, with no question in them and no performance either. Just her name in the mouth of the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, spoken like he had already decided it was worth keeping. She had been called many things in her life. Girl, Omega, debt. She had been called Sera too, of course, but always with something underneath it. Pity or impatience, or the particular diminishment of people who used your name to remind you that they knew it, and could therefore know other things about you too. He had not done that. She did not know what he had done instead. That was the problem. She got up before dawn and dressed in the charcoal wool dress again. The underlinen first, soft against her skin, then the dress, then the lacing of the overdress which she did herself by feel in the dark, because she would not light the lamp just to get dressed. That felt like an extravagance she hadn't earned yet. She rewound her suppressant bands last, standing at the window while pale gray light began to separate the sky from the tree line of the inner courtyard below. Her wrists were sore under the linen. They were always sore, the constant pressure of the wrapping, the perpetual suppression of the thing she had been born as. She wound them tighter anyway. Habit. Armor. A girl appeared at her door an hour after dawn with a breakfast tray, warm bread, a soft-boiled egg, a small pot of something dark and bitter that turned out, on first sip, to be a northern grain tea she had never tasted before. Strong enough to feel like a decision. She drank all of it standing at her window, watching the courtyard come alive below. She watched for a long time. She was watching when he crossed the courtyard. She almost missed him. He moved without ceremony, no announcement, no escort beyond a single guard at a distance that suggested habit rather than necessity. He was dressed plainly for a king, dark wool, no ornamentation, boots that were made for actual use. He was speaking to a man beside him, one of his advisors, she thought, though she didn't know enough yet to be sure. And the conversation looked serious, the kind of serious that didn't require volume. He gestured once, briefly, to indicate something beyond the courtyard wall. The advisor nodded. Rhoran looked up. He looked directly at her window. She did not move. She did not step back. She was not sure if he could see her from that distance, in the low morning light, through the gap in the shutters. But she held still anyway, because retreating felt like admission of something she had not decided to admit. He looked for one long moment. Then he looked back at his advisor and continued speaking. Sera let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and went to put her boots on. Marette arrived mid-morning with a woman she introduced as Fen, younger, sharp-eyed, with the energy of someone who moved through the world at twice the necessary speed. Fen will show you the household, Marette said. Where you're permitted to go, where you're not, how things work here. She paused and looked at Sera with the same direct assessment she'd delivered at arrival. Do you have questions before she starts? Sera had approximately 40 questions. She selected the one that felt most strategically useful. What am I expected to do here? She asked. My function. What does he want from me? Something moved through Marette's expression, not quite surprise, more like recalibration. He'll discuss that with you himself, she said. Today your function is to learn the house. She left. Fen looked at Sera with open curiosity and very little of Marette's professional reserve. You're braver than the last one, Fen said. The last what? Sera asked. The last acquisition. She said the word without cruelty, just matter of fact. She cried for 3 days before he'd even spoken to her. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't leave her room. She paused. He sent her home, in the end. Paid her passage himself. Sera absorbed this. He sent her home. He doesn't keep people who are miserable, Fen said simply, and then turned and walked briskly down the corridor. Come on. I'll show you the kitchens first. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, and considerably less grim. There were tapestries in the east corridors. Old ones, dark with age, depicting hunting scenes and battle formations, and one that appeared to show a woman standing on a cliff above a burning fleet with an expression of profound satisfaction. There were bookshelves in unexpected places. A small alcove off the main corridor with a window seat and 3 shelves of volumes, clearly used. A library proper on the second level that made Sera stop in the doorway and breathe it in. The particular smell of old paper and binding leather, and the kind of accumulated thought that only came from rooms where people actually read. You can use it, Fen said from behind her. Household staff have access. There's a register on the side table. You note what you take and return it when you're done. She paused. Can you read? Yes, Sera said. Fen nodded like this, confirmed something. He'll be glad of that, she said, and moved on before Sera could ask what she meant. The kitchens were warm and loud and smelled of the best things Sera had encountered in recent memory. Actual food. Real food. The kind that required time and intention. Bread baking. Something long simmered on the back stove. A kitchen girl reducing something dark and wine-heavy in a pan that made Sera's stomach contract with want. She was fed again at midday without asking. A proper meal, at the household staff table, a bowl of the long-simmered stew with good bread to pull through it, and a cup of something warm and spiced that she drank too fast, and then sat with the empty cup, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, physically full. It was a disorienting sensation. She sat with it carefully, like something that might be taken back, then watched her from across the table with that sharp, open curiosity. When did you last eat properly? She asked. I ate on the road, Sera said. Before the road. Sera considered lying. She did not see the use in it. Not recently, she said. Fen's expression did something brief and complicated. Then she refilled Sera's cup without being asked and changed the subject to the household schedule, and Sera understood that this too was a form of kindness, the kind that didn't require you to perform gratitude for it. He summoned her that evening, not to the working room this time, to a different room on the upper level, smaller. She found when Devan walked her to it, more private. A sitting room with a fire already built high and 2 chairs, and a low table between them set with wine, and what looked like a small plate of the dark spiced bread from the kitchens. The kind of setting that someone had arranged. The kind of arrangement that required a decision. Rhoran was already there when she entered. He was standing again. She was beginning to think he defaulted to standing, that sitting was something he did as a concession rather than a preference, like a large animal that had learned to occupy smaller spaces out of courtesy. He had changed from his morning clothes into something that fit him differently, a shirt unlaced at the throat, the kind of dark gray that matched everything else about this palace, the sleeves pushed back to the forearm. Not dressed down exactly. Dressed like a man in his own home, who was not performing anything for anyone. It hit her somewhere low and inconvenient, that image. She filed it under observations that require no further examination, and kept her face even. "Sit," he said, and this time it came out differently than it had the night before. Less directive, more invitation, the single syllable carrying a different weight. He sat when she did, which she noticed. He waited until she was settled before he folded himself into the opposite chair, and the deliberateness of it, the courtesy of it, made the back of her neck prickle again in the way she was trying very hard not to catalogue. He poured wine for her first. She watched his hands doing it. Large hands, scarred at the knuckles in the way of men who had been in real fights rather than formal ones, the kind of hands that could break things, and apparently chose, in this moment, to pour wine instead. She picked up the cup when he set it in front of her. The wine was dark and warm and tasted of something faintly resinous, like the forest she'd seen through the carriage window. "How was the house?" he asked. "Large," she said. "Better stocked than I expected." "What did you expect?" She looked at him. In the firelight, the planes of his face were starker. The jaw, the brow, the scar at his throat catching the light and releasing it. He was watching her with that same steady, patient attention he'd given her the night before. The kind of attention that didn't waver and didn't press, that simply waited and let you decide what to do with it. "I don't know exactly," she said. Something harsher. "You'd heard stories. Everyone's heard stories." "And?" he asked, the same word Davin had used on the road. "And?" Like he was genuinely interested in the completion of her thought, rather than just the performance of asking. "And I'm revising them," she said. Something shifted in his expression, slow, like light changing on stone. Not quite a smile. Something that preceded a smile, in the way that heat preceded fire. "Fen says you can read," he said. Fen talks constantly," he agreed. And the dryness of it, the ordinary human dryness of it, startled a small sound out of her. Not quite a laugh, something smaller, something she pulled back almost before it escaped. His eyes moved to her mouth when she did it. Just briefly. Just a flicker. She felt it like a touch anyway, that flicker. Felt it run from her mouth down through her chest and settle somewhere in the vicinity of her stomach, with no intention of leaving. She rewound her suppressant bands tighter under the table. "Not that it helped. I want to explain your situation here," he said, and his voice had shifted back to something more deliberate, something that told her he had prepared for this part. "What you were told before you came, that you are property, that you belong to this household as a possession, that is the legal framing of the transaction. It is not how I run my house." She said nothing. She was listening with everything she had. "You will not be required to perform any function you have not agreed to," he said. "You will not be touched without your consent. You will eat, you will have your room, you will have access to the library and the grounds within the inner wall." He paused. "What I ask in return is honest dealings. You don't perform for me and I won't perform for you. If something is wrong, you tell Maret or Davin. If something is very wrong, you tell me directly." The fire crackled between them. Outside the high window, the wind had picked up, the particular low sound of northern wind through stone corridors that she was already beginning to recognize. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her. "Why what? Why those terms?" she said. "You paid for me. The law gives you considerably more latitude than that." The line of his jaw tightened. Not in anger, she thought, but in something that required effort to keep contained. "The law gives me latitude I don't intend to use," he said. "I acquired you under terms I didn't design and can't immediately undo. What I can do is govern how you're treated within my house." He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you how you'll be treated." The fire crackled again. Sera looked at him. This large, still, carefully controlled man with his unlaced collar and his scarred hands and his wine that tasted of his forests. And felt something she had not felt in a very long time, possibly ever. The specific, alarming sensation of wanting to believe someone. She did not trust it. She had not survived this long by trusting it, but she felt it. She noted it. She filed it somewhere that requires no further examination, because it very clearly required further examination. "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he reached forward and broke off a piece of the spiced bread from the plate between them and held it out to her across the low table. Not quite an offering, not quite a command, just a hand extended with something in it, steady and unhurried, waiting to see what she did. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. She was aware of the inch of air between them, with a precision that was embarrassing, given that nothing had actually happened. She ate the bread. It was good. Everything in this palace was, infuriatingly, good. "I'll leave you to your evening," he said after a while. He rose when she did. Again, the deliberateness of it, rising with her, the courtesy so practiced it seemed structural rather than performed. He was close when they both stood, the low table the only distance between them, and at this proximity she became aware of several things simultaneously. How much space he occupied without trying to, the warmth that came off him in the cool room like a furnace banked low, and the scent. His scent. She had been so focused on keeping her own scent suppressed that she had not let herself register his, and now, standing close enough that she could see the fine grain of the scar at his throat, it hit her like a physical thing. Dark and mineral and cold, like snow on stone, like snow on stone, like the forests through her window, like the blanket on the carriage bench that had made sleeping easy. That scent. She understood now that it had not been cedar at all. It had been him, something of him worked into the fabric, and she had been sleeping wrapped in it for 18 days without knowing what she was breathing. Her omega instincts, so long suppressed, so thoroughly bound and controlled and denied, lurched like something waking up midwinter, confused and furious and very interested. She stepped back. One step. Smooth, deliberate, she hoped. She kept her face neutral. She wound the suppressant bands tighter in her mind even though her hands were at her sides. And the gesture was only metaphorical. He had gone very still, not frozen, not startled. Still in the way he was always still, but differently. Like a man who had just registered something he had not been expecting and was now deciding what to do with it. His dark eyes were on her face, and she could not read what was in them, only that there was more of it than there had been a moment ago. "Good night, Sera," he said. His voice was lower than it had been, not softer. Lower, the difference between a flame turned down and a flame contained. "Good night, my lord," she said. She walked out with her back straight and her hands flat at her sides, and she did not look back at him in the doorway, though she felt his gaze on her all the way down the corridor until the turn of the staircase took her out of his line of sight. She went to her room, she bolted the door, she sat on the edge of her bed and unwound her suppressant bands for the first time since arriving, because her wrists were aching and she was alone, and the door was bolted, and she could permit herself this much. The amber scent rose the moment the linen fell away. Faint, controlled, but present. Her own scent, the thing she had spent her whole life apologizing for and hiding and binding down. She sat with it in the quiet of her bolted room and breathed. Her skin felt too warm. Her pulse was doing something she disapproved of. The inch of air between his hand and hers felt, in retrospect, like the most charged inch of space she had ever occupied. She pressed her cool palms to her cheeks and stared at the dark ceiling of a room she had not expected to be safe in a palace she had not expected to contain trees, belonging to a king she had not expected to pour wine for her first. She was in significant trouble, not the kind she had prepared for. Worse than that kind, the kind you couldn't see coming because it didn't announce itself as a threat. The kind that arrived in the form of steady dark eyes and a voice that said your name like it intended to keep it, and hands that could break things choosing instead, carefully, deliberately, to offer bread. She rewound her suppressant bands before she slept. She wound them tight. It did not entirely help. Outside her window, in the inner courtyard below, the trees moved in the northern wind, and the fire in the great hall burned low. And somewhere in the east wing of the palace, the king of Varek sat alone in a room that still carried, faintly, the amber warmth of a scent he had not been prepared for, and stayed very still for a long time. Chapter 3. The Gift. 3 weeks passed. Sera learned the palace the way she had learned every difficult thing in her life, methodically, without sentiment, one room at a time. She learned which corridors caught the morning light, and which stayed cold until noon. She learned that the kitchen girl's name was Brea, and that she sang under her breath while she worked, and that if you appeared in the kitchen doorway at the right hour she would hand you something warm without being asked. No conversation required. She learned that the library's second shelf from the top on the eastern wall held the oldest books, the ones with cracked spines and faded titles, and that someone had been reading them recently, because 3 of them had bookmarks in places that were too far along to be decorative. She did not let herself think too hard about whose bookmarks those were. She learned the rhythms of the household, when Merit did her morning rounds, when the guard rotation changed, when Rhoran's council met in the East Hall and the corridors around it went quiet and deliberate. She learned to read the temperature of the palace the way you read weather. Certain silences meant certain things, certain movements meant others. She also learned, slowly and against her will, that the stories about Rhoran were not simply exaggerated. They were wrong in the way that stories were always wrong about men whose actual character was more complicated than legend could accommodate. The southern provinces had constructed a monster because a monster was easier to understand than what he actually was. a man of absolute consequence who had chosen, deliberately and at some personal cost, to govern himself by a code that most men in his position would have found unnecessary. She saw it in small things. The way he stopped a dispute between two household guards, not by invoking his authority, but by asking each of them a question, and then waiting while they talked themselves to resolution. The way he reviewed the household accounts himself once a week, rather than delegating it entirely, sitting at the desk in his working room with the ledger open and his reading glasses. She had not expected reading glasses. That detail had done something irreparable to her composure the first time she'd seen it, perched at the end of his nose. The way he noticed things. The way he remembered things. He remembered things about her specifically, which was the part she was least prepared for. 3 days after the evening with the wine and the bread and the inch of charged air, he had passed her in the corridor outside the library with a book under his arm and stopped. "How are your feet?" he asked. She had stared at him. "My feet? The heel. Moret said the shoes from your journey had done damage." "It healed," she said, after a moment. "Thank you." He had nodded and walked on, and she had stood in the corridor holding her library book and feeling the specific, off-balance sensation of being noticed by someone with no apparent motive for noticing. A week after that she had mentioned, in passing to Fen, that the green tea they served at breakfast was too bitter for her taste. 2 days later, a different tea appeared on her morning tray, something lighter, with something floral in it she couldn't identify. She had asked Fen about it. Fen had looked at the middle distance and said, with suspicious casualness, "Kitchen must have changed the order," and changed the subject. Sera had drunk the tea. It was exactly right. She had drunk it looking out her window at the courtyard below, where Rhoran was crossing toward the stables, and thought, with a clarity that alarmed her, "I am in so much trouble." The evenings were the problem. He had established a habit. She was not sure when it had become a habit, only that at some point it had solidified from occasional into expected, of summoning her after dinner 2 or 3 times a week. Always the same upper sitting room. Always the fire, the wine, the small plate of something from the kitchen. Always those 2 chairs at angles to each other, close enough to talk easily, far enough that she could keep her breathing steady. They talked. This was the part she had no framework for. Not the courtesy, not the good food, not even the tea. Those she could file under strategic management of an acquisition, ensuring the investment remained functional. The talking she could not file anywhere useful. He asked her things, not interrogation style, not the pointed questioning of someone extracting information, genuine questions, the kind that required real answers. What had she read in the library this week? What she thought of the northern weather compared to the south? Whether she had any skill with horses, because the spring foals were coming and the stable master was short-handed, and she had mentioned once, briefly, that her father had kept horses before the drought. She answered. She did not intend to answer as fully as she did. She intended to give him the serviceable, surface-level responses of someone who was being careful. What she actually gave him, increasingly, was the truth. She blamed his attention for this. It was very difficult to give a half answer to someone who was listening to the whole of what you said. She told him about her father's horses. She told him about the drought years, the slow erosion of everything the Fisher family had been. She told him about the suppressant bands, not emotionally, clinically, the way you described a tool you had learned to use. And he had listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and then said, very quietly, "You shouldn't have had to do that." And the simplicity of it, the flatness of the anger underneath it that he was keeping contained for her benefit, had made her throat close in a way she'd had to breathe through carefully. He told her things too. Not everything. She understood there were rooms inside him that had never been opened for anyone, and she was not naive enough to think 3 weeks of evening conversations had changed that. But things. The war in the East that had ended 2 years ago, the cost of it that the southern provinces had never heard accurately, the advisor who had died last winter, an old man, the one person in his council who had known him since before he was a king, and had therefore been incapable of treating him like one. He said this last part without self-pity, flatly, and she understood it for what it was. A man telling her something true about his loneliness without calling it that. She did not call it that either. She filed it somewhere central, and stayed very still. The scent problem was getting worse. She knew it was getting worse because she was rewinding her suppressant bands 3 times a day now instead of 2, and the ache in her wrists had become a constant rather than an intermittent thing. Her omega instincts, insufficiently suppressed, had developed extremely specific opinions about the proximity of Rhoran of Varek, and were expressing those opinions in ways she found profoundly inconvenient. The prickle at the back of her neck that began approximately 30 seconds before he entered any room she was in, the warmth that moved through her when he leaned forward in his chair, and the firelight caught the angle of his jaw, the almost painful attentiveness with which her body registered every time he looked at her mouth. He looked at her mouth when she said something that surprised him. She had noticed the pattern, She had catalogued it with the intense, mortified precision of someone who would have very much preferred not to notice. He was not unaffected either. She was not arrogant enough to be certain about this, but she had been reading rooms her whole life and she was good at it. The way he went still when she entered. Not the neutral stillness of his default state, but something more concentrated. The way his hands, those scarred, careful hands, would occasionally tighten on the arm of his chair for a moment before releasing. The way he had, twice now, started to say something and then stopped, the words rerouted, the original sentence replaced with something safer. She did not pursue any of this. She was still waiting for the trick in it. She had been waiting for 3 weeks, and it had not arrived, and she was beginning to develop the deeply unsettling suspicion that there was no trick. The formal summons came on a morning in the 4th week. Not Davin at her door with a quiet word, not Fen with a message folded in her apron pocket. A household page, young and very serious, with a sealed note on a small tray. The seal was the fractured crown of Varek. She opened it at her window, in the good morning light. Your presence is requested in the great hall at the 3rd bell. Formal attendance. Formal attendance. She had not been in the great hall. She had walked past it, had seen the doors, heavy iron-banded oak, twice her height, but it had not been part of Fen's tour and she had not pushed. She understood instinctively that the great hall was for things that required witnesses. She dressed carefully. The charcoal dress with the full lacing, the good underlinen, her hair pinned up in the way she'd worked out, produced the most composed impression. She wound her suppressant bands with particular thoroughness. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, with her hands in her lap and breathed. Whatever this is, she told herself, you have survived worse. She had. She knew she had. She went to the great hall. It was full, not packed, not the chaotic fullness of a market. The ordered fullness of a court in formal assembly. Household staff along the walls, advisors in a cluster to the right, a contingent of guards at attention flanking the dais at the far end. Faces she recognized from the corridors and the kitchens and the library, now arranged into something formal and witness-shaped. And at the far end, on the dais, Rhoran. She had seen him in his working clothes, and his evening informality, and his morning coat crossing the courtyard. She had not seen him like this. He was in full formal dress. Dark, everything dark but structured now, the kind of clothing that had been made specifically for the body wearing it. A long coat in near black wool with the silver fractured crown sigil at the breast. Assorted his hip, she had not seen him wear before. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic stillness, and looked, at this distance, exactly like what he was, a king. The kind of king that stories got wrong, because the true version was more difficult to describe than either monster or hero. She walked the length of the hall. She was aware of every eye on her. She kept her chin up and her gait even and her hand still, and she walked until she was 10 feet from the dais, and stopped and met his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Something she could not fully name. Something that had too many components to reduce to a single word. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the full length of the hall with no effort at all. The voice of a man who had commanded armies and knew how to use his size even in stillness. Sera Fisher, he said, you were brought to this house under terms of acquisition, as settlement of a debt held against your family by a creditor of the southern provinces. He paused. Those terms are being dissolved. The hall was very quiet. He descended the dais steps, unhurried, deliberate, and crossed to her. At close range, in the formal coat, he was even more arresting than usual. She could smell him from here, that dark mineral cold scent, and her wrists ached in the tight linen bands. She held very still. He held out a folded document. She took it. Her fingers did not shake. She was proud of this. These are freedom papers, he said, and his voice was quieter now, for her rather than the hall. Legal, binding, recognized under the seals of 7 kingdoms, including this one. You are no longer property of this household, or any household. You owe no debt. You are bound to no contract. He paused. You are free to leave Ashkord at any time, with provisions and escort for wherever you choose to go. She looked down at the document in her hands. It was real. She had seen enough legal papers in her life, had watched enough transactions happen around her, to know what she was holding. The seals were pressed in dark wax along the bottom, 7 of them, each one representing a kingdom that would recognize the document she was currently holding. Her name was at the top, written in a clear hand. Sera Fisher, formerly designated as acquired property under Southern Province debt law, is henceforth recognized as a free person under full legal standing. The hall was still quiet. She was aware of the witnesses along the walls, the weight of their attention, the significance of what was being recorded in their presence. She looked up at him. Why? She asked. It came out quieter than she intended, the words stripped of all the armor she'd meant to put around it. He held her gaze steadily. Because you should never have been sold, he said. and I cannot undo that it happened. I can only undo what comes after. The fire in the great hearth at the side wall crackled. Somewhere near the doors, a guard shifted his weight. The hall breathed around them, and Sera stood in the middle of it, holding her freedom in both hands, and felt something inside her chest do something she had not permitted it to do in a very long time. Crack, just slightly, along a line she hadn't known was there. She did not cry. She would not cry in a full hall with 7 kingdoms worth of witnesses watching. But her eyes went bright, and she had to breathe through it carefully, and she thought, very clearly, in the silence of her own mind, "Oh, so this is who he actually is. I can leave," she said. Confirming it. Making it real. "Whenever you choose," he said. "And if I don't choose to leave?" Something shifted in him. Barely perceptible, a degree, the way light shifted on stone. "Then you remain as a guest of this household," he said. "Under no obligation. With full access to the grounds and the library and Brea's kitchen, which I have been reliably informed is the best argument for staying in Ashkord that exists." The corner of her mouth moved. She felt it happen, and couldn't entirely prevent it. "I've heard that," she said. The tension in the hall did something, eased, fractionally, in the way tension eased when something that had been held very tight was allowed to exist differently. She was aware of Davin at the edge of her vision, arms folded, expression carefully neutral in the way that meant he was trying not to look satisfied. She was aware of Maret near the wall, straight-backed and composed. She was aware of Fen somewhere behind her, who she would be willing to bet was not bothering with the neutral expression at all. She looked back down at the document. At her name at the top of it, written clearly, permanent, in ink that was already dry. She folded it carefully. She looked up at Rhoran. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, plainly given, no performance in them, the truest thing she had said to anyone in years. She watched them land on him, watched something in his face receive them with a care that told her he understood exactly what it had cost her to say them that simply. He inclined his head. 1 degree. The way kings inclined their heads when something mattered. "The hall is dismissed," he said to the room, and then, to her quietly, "Come to the sitting room tonight, if you want. No obligation." He walked back up to the dais, and she walked back down the length of the hall on legs that were steadier than they had any right to be, the folded papers held against her chest with both hands, thinking about nothing very coherently, thinking about everything at once. She went back to her room. She sat on the bed and unfolded the papers again and read them through completely, every line, every clause, every seal. They were exactly what he had said they were. She could leave. She could walk out of the iron-banded gates of Ashkord with an escort and provisions and this document and never come back. She sat with that for a long time. Then she reached under the mattress where she had been keeping the only thing she had brought from her old life. Not the ivory dress, which she had folded at the bottom of the chest and not touched since she'd changed out of it, but a small square of cloth, dark with age, embroidered at the edge in the same faded gold as the dress's collar. A piece of something her mother had made, cut away, and kept because it was small enough to carry. She held it in one hand and the freedom papers in the other, and sat in the afternoon light of a room she had bolted from the inside every night because she could, in a palace full of trees and good books and tea that was exactly right, and thought about leaving. She thought about leaving for a long time. Outside her window, in the courtyard, a late winter wind moved through the dark pines, and the cold, clear light of Ashkord fell across the stone in a way that was not beautiful like painted landscapes but beautiful like blades, like the truth, like things that did not need to perform their worth, because their worth was simply, undeniably what they were. She put the cloth square away. She kept the freedom papers out on the side table where she can see them. She began, for the first time, to think about what it would mean to stay, not because she had to but because she chose to. And the shape of that thought was terrifying and specific and centered, with a clarity she could no longer pretend was inconvenient, on a man in a dark formal coat, who had given her the one thing she had never had, and asked for nothing in return. She rewound her suppressant bands. Then she sat at her window until the light went gold and long, and the 3rd bell rang somewhere in the palace depths, and she thought, tonight. The sitting room. No obligation. She dressed for the evening before the echo of the bell had finished. Chapter 4. The unraveling. She went to the sitting room. She told herself she was going because it was the sensible thing to do, because leaving without information was strategically foolish, because she needed to understand the full parameters of her new situation before she made any decisions, because the fire would be warm and the wine would be good, and none of that had anything to do with the man who would be sitting across from her in the chair that had, over the past 3 weeks, begun to feel like his chair specifically. She was lying to herself, and she knew it, and she went anyway. He was already there when she arrived. Standing, as always. But he turned when she came through the door, and something happened to his expression that he didn't fully control, a brief, unguarded thing that was gone almost before she could register it. Almost. He had seen her in the hall that afternoon with the freedom papers pressed against her chest. He had watched her walk back down the length of the room, with her chin up and her eyes bright, and her hands holding what he had given her like it was something she intended to keep. And now she was here, in the evening, in the sitting room, which meant she had chosen to be here, and he knew it, and she knew that he knew it, and the air between them had a different quality than it had ever had before. Charged in a way that had nothing to do with suppression, and everything to do with the fact that the dynamic between them had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. She was not property. She was a woman who had chosen to walk through his door. "You came," he said. "I said I might," she said. "You didn't say that." "I implied it." The corner of his mouth moved. She was keeping a private count of the times she had made that happen. The number was becoming significant. She sat in her chair and he sat in his, and Fen appeared briefly with wine and the spiced bread, and disappeared again with the efficient invisibility of someone who had been specifically instructed to be invisible. They sat. The fire was high. Outside the window, the wind had picked up into something serious, the first real storm of late winter throwing itself against the palace walls with the particular fury of weather that had been patient too long. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The advisor you told me about," she said. "The old man. The one who died last winter." She paused. "Was he the last person in this palace who spoke to you honestly?" The silence lasted long enough that she thought she'd pushed past a boundary she hadn't been able to see. Then he said, quietly, "Yes, that's a long time to go without honest speech." "It is," he said. She looked at him across the fire. "I'll speak to you honestly," she said. "If you want it." He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was something she recognized because she had felt it herself. The particular expression of someone who wanted something badly enough that the wanting had become its own kind of pain. "I want it," he said. The storm broke fully an hour later. She heard it change. The wind shifting from low complaint to something higher and more urgent, rain beginning against the shutters in sheets rather than drops, the palace settling into itself under the weight of it the way old stone structures did, groaning faintly at the joints, pressing deeper into their own foundations. She liked storms. She had always liked storms. There was an honesty about them, the way they made no pretense of being anything other than what they were. They had been talking, easily, the way they talked now, the conversation moving through things that mattered without needing to announce that they mattered. When the door to the sitting room opened without a knock, she knew, the moment she saw his face, that something was wrong. It was one of Rhoran's senior advisors, a man she had seen in the corridors but not spoken to, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since sharpened into something less readable. Lord Casvan. She had learned his name from Fen, who had offered it with a very specific tone that Sera had filed as relevant. Revisit later. She was revising it to relevant now. He looked at her with an expression he didn't fully conceal. Not hostility exactly, something more calculated than hostility. The assessment of someone who had identified a variable in a formula they thought they had already solved. "My lord," he said to Rhoran. "A word." "You're interrupting," Rhoran said. His voice was level, completely level, in the way that level voices were sometimes more dangerous than raised ones. "It's a matter of some urgency," Casvan said. He looked at Sera again. Briefly, dismissively, the look that men like this gave women like her when they wanted to communicate that the look was itself a message. "Regarding the acquisition, her name," Rhoran said, "is Sera." A beat. Casvan adjusted. "Regarding Sera," he said, with the careful enunciation of a man who understood he had just been corrected and was deciding what to do about it. "There is a concern among several members of the council regarding the papers issued this afternoon." Sera kept her face neutral. She set down her wine cup because she wanted her hands free, and the wanting of that felt instinctively correct. "What concern?" Rhoran said. "Not a question." "The perception it creates," Casvan said. "Afreed Omega walking the palace as a guest." "As a guest, my lord, with no formal designation, no household role, no contractual basis for her presence. It raises questions. About judgment. About, choose your next word carefully," Rhoran said. The fire crackled. The storm pushed at the shutters. Casvan looked at the floor for a brief moment and then back up, and Sera watched him recalibrate. The specific recalibration of a man who had prepared a speech for a version of this conversation that was not the one he was currently in. "There are those on the council," he said more carefully, "who feel the situation could be used by external parties as evidence of instability. The Eastern Territories are watching, my lord. Lord Brenvar's people specifically have been asking questions about your personal—" "I'm aware of what Brenvar's people ask," Rhoran said. "I've been aware of it for considerably longer than you have." "Then you understand the position." "I understand," Rhoran said. that you've come to my private rooms during a storm to tell me that my decision to grant a woman her legal freedom is a liability." He paused. "I want you to think carefully about whether you want to continue this conversation." Kazvan was not a stupid man. Sera watched him read the room, the two of them by the fire, the quality of the air between them, the freedom papers she had not left in her room but had tucked into the pocket of her overdress because she had not wanted to leave them alone, and arrive at a conclusion that visibly complicated his prepared position. "I'm raising the concern formally," he said finally, "so that it is noted that it was raised." He looked at Sera one more time, and this time what was in the look was something she had seen before. The look of a man assessing a problem he intended to return to when the circumstances were more favorable. "I'll leave you to your evening." He left, the door closed. The storm filled the silence he left behind. Sera said, without inflection. "He'll come back." "Yes," Rhoran said. "And the others he mentioned, the council members. They've been a slow problem for some time," he said. "This accelerated it." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know that it changes nothing about this morning. The papers are legal and binding, and not subject to council review. Your status in this house is not a matter they have authority over." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You're not frightened." "I've been frightened for most of my life," she said. "I've gotten quite efficient at it. What I'm feeling right now is something different." She paused. "I'm angry." Something flared in his expression, not alarmed, the opposite of alarmed, something that looked almost like relief, like a man who had been waiting for her to show him a sharp edge and was glad to finally see it. "Tell me," he said. "He looked at me like I was something to be managed," she said, "like I was a factor in a political equation. Like the only question worth asking about my presence here was what it cost you and whether the cost could be reduced." She looked at Rhoran steadily. "I have been looked at like that my whole life. By everyone who ever sold me or held my debt or decided my value in relation to someone else's problem." She paused. "I find I'm no longer willing to be looked at like that." The fire between them burned. The storm outside reached some kind of peak and then began, slowly, to ease. Rhoran was looking at her with an intensity that had moved beyond his usual patient attention into something more unguarded, something she had not seen from him before, the interior rooms showing, the door not quite closed all the way. "You shouldn't have had to be," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Any of it." "From the beginning." "No," she said. "I shouldn't have." They looked at each other across the fire, and the low table, and the remnants of the wine and the bread, and something that had been building for 4 weeks. Some accumulation of evenings and corridors and morning windows and tea that was exactly right, and freedom papers pressed against a chest that had not known how to receive them, reached a kind of critical density that Sera felt physically, like pressure changing before weather. She reached up and began to unwrap her suppressant bands. She did it slowly, deliberately, holding his gaze while she did it. The linen unwound from her left wrist first, then her right, then the inside of each elbow, the layers coming away one by one, and with each layer the amber warmth of her scent rose into the room, faint at first and then present, then undeniable. Her actual scent, the thing she had been born with and spent 20 years apologizing for, filling the warm firelit air of the sitting room like something finally, quietly exhaling. Rhoran had gone completely still, not his usual stillness. This was something deeper, something that had its roots in instinct rather than training. The absolute attention of an alpha in the presence of an omega who had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of what she was doing, to lower every barrier between them. His eyes had darkened. His hands, she noticed, were gripping the arms of his chair, with a restraint that was visible in the tendons of his wrists. Sera. Her name in his voice, at a register she had not heard from him before. Low and careful and containing a question and a warning, and something that was neither, all at once. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "Tell me anyway," he said. "I need to hear you say it." She looked at him steadily. This man who had sent 4 armed men across 3 weeks of road, and fed her 3 times a day, and given her a room with a bolt on the inside and red glasses, and a tea she had only mentioned once, and her freedom, her actual freedom, legal, and 7 sealed, and pressed against her chest. This man who had not once, not in 4 weeks, taken a single thing she had not given. "I'm staying," she said, "not because I have nowhere to go, not because leaving is difficult, or the provisions aren't ready, or the escort isn't arranged. I'm staying because I want to be here. Because this is the first place I have ever been where I was." She paused, the words requiring more precision than she'd needed for a long time. "Where I was seen accurately," she said. "Where I was given room to be exactly what I am and not required to make it smaller or apologize for it or bind it down." She held his gaze. "I'm staying because of you, and I am choosing to say that plainly because you told me you wanted honest speech, and I intend to give it to you." The fire had burned down to something lower and more intimate. Outside, the storm had settled into steady rain, the kind that would last through the night, quiet and relentless against the stone. He rose from his chair. He crossed the small space between them and she stood to meet him. Not because she had to, because she wanted to, because being on her feet felt like the right position for what was happening, like standing upright to receive something important. He stopped close enough that she had to look up at him, close enough that his scent, that dark mineral cold, snow on stone, forests in winter, was everything, was the whole room. He raised one hand and touched her face. Just his fingertips, the scarred knuckles she had been cataloging for 4 weeks, tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that was so careful, so deliberate, so entirely chosen, that she felt it move through her like a key in a lock she hadn't known she'd been keeping. "I've been waiting," he said, "since the first night. Since you sat across from me in that chair and told me you were property like you were daring me to agree with you." His thumb moved along her cheekbone, slow and certain. "I have wanted to touch you every day since then. I want you to know that. And I want you to know that I would have waited indefinitely. I would have waited until you were ready, or until you left, or until you never chose any of this at all, and I would have considered it a reasonable outcome, because you were free, and what you did with that freedom was entirely yours." "I know," she said, and her voice was lower than usual, affected by his proximity in a way she didn't attempt to conceal. "That's part of why I'm not leaving." His other hand came to her waist, warm, certain, steady, the kind of touch that didn't take, that simply arrived and waited to see if it was welcome. She answered it by stepping closer, closing the last distance between them, and felt the breath move through him at the contact. Not a sharp breath, something slower, something that sounded like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying for some time. She put her hand against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat under her palm, steadier than hers, but present, real, a little faster than his controlled exterior would suggest. "You should know," she said, looking up at him, "that I am not easy. I have opinions about most things, and I will tell you what they are. I don't trust quickly, and I won't pretend to trust before I do. I will read your books and drink your tea and argue with your advisors if they look at me that way again, and I won't apologize for any of it." "Good," he said, and the word was so immediate, so entirely without reservation, that she felt it like warmth through her whole chest. "Also," she said, "the green tea at breakfast is still too bitter, and someone should address that permanently." A sound came out of him. Low, brief, entirely genuine, the laugh of a man who had not laughed like that in a long time and was slightly surprised to find himself doing it. It moved through his chest under her palm, and she felt it like something precious, like something she intended to collect more of. "I'll have a word with the kitchen," he said, and his voice was still low but different now, the control loosened by something real underneath it, the interior rooms open, the door finally, fully ajar. He bent his head toward hers slowly. The same deliberateness he applied to everything, the same patience that she had learned to stop reading as coldness and start reading as respect, as the choice of a man who did nothing carelessly because nothing in his life had ever been without consequence. She met him halfway. That felt right. That felt like exactly the correct architecture of this moment. Neither of them waiting for the other, both of them choosing, both of them arriving at the same point by different roads that had somehow, improbably, ended in the same place. His mouth on hers was careful at first, the first touch barely a question, and she answered it clearly, and the question became something else. Certain. Warm. His hand moving from her jaw to the back of her neck, with a gentleness that turned, by degrees, into something with more intention behind it. She pressed her hand flat against his chest and kissed him back with the full force of 4 weeks of careful suppression, of every suppressant band rewound too tight, of every inch of charged air she had catalogued and filed and pretended was not doing what it was doing, and felt him respond to it with a low sound against her mouth that she was going to remember for a very long time. When they finally separated, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. She felt him rest his forehead against hers, both of them breathing, the fire warm at their backs, the rain steady against the shutters, the palace around them quiet and settling, and theirs. "Stay," he said quietly, "not an order. Something much more exposed than an order." She opened her eyes and looked at him, this man who was a king and a reader and a keeper of trees inside fortress walls, who had given her freedom before he had allowed himself to want anything from her, who looked at her like she was something worth seeing clearly, like accuracy was its own form of devotion. "I already told you," she said. "I'm staying." She kept the freedom papers on her side table. She looked at them every morning when she woke. In her room that became, gradually and without ceremony, a room she shared. In a palace that became, over the weeks and months that followed, something she stopped waiting to have taken from her and started allowing herself to call home. She kept them not as a reminder of where she'd come from, but as a reminder of what choosing felt like. The weight of it, the particular quality of something that was entirely yours. The council remained a slow problem. Casvin remained a specific one. There were difficult conversations and harder meetings, and at least one formal confrontation in the East Hall that Sera attended, standing at Rhoran's right side, with her suppressant bands off and her chin up, and said 3 things with such precise, devastating clarity that Davin later told her 2 of the senior guards had started a private count of her best lines. She was not easy. She had promised him she wouldn't be. He was not uncomplicated. He had never claimed to be. What they were, built in the space between honesty and patience, and the slow accumulation of chosen mornings, was something that required no name more elaborate than what it simply, clearly was. 2 people who had spent their whole lives being misread, finally, stubbornly, accurately seen. She kept the freedom papers on the side table. She never needed to use them. She never stopped being glad they were there. Thanks for reading. If you enjoyed this journey through Ashkord, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the YouTube channel for more stories like this one.